Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Hopefully, we'll have Mira on screen in a moment. Let me apologize, first of all, if you were expecting to see Will Heaven from MIT Tech Review here moderating this. Will is ill, so I'm filling in for him. But hopefully, we'll have Mira here on screen in a moment, and we can start. There she is. Hi, Mira. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you.
Great. So we have Mira Murati. She's the Chief Technology Officer at OpenAI. And I think we'll start out, for those of you who may not be familiar with OpenAI or know only a little bit about the company, for instance, that it was co-founded by Elon Musk. That's something people often know. But sometimes people have tuned out on what's happened sort of since then. Mira, can you just kind of give a very quick overview of who you guys are at OpenAI and what you're all about?
For sure. First of all, thank you for having me here today. The goal of OpenAI is to build general artificial intelligence and to make sure that it benefits humanity. And I work with our teams to make large advances in AI systems that we then can deploy in useful applications in a way that's maximally effective and robustly beneficial. And as part of this effort, we are trying to teach machines to understand the world in a similar way that humans do.
Great. And some people may know at least one of your products, which is GPT-3, which is a large language system that can generate lots of long passages of coherent text that is often sort of indistinguishable from what a human might compose. Although there are some limitations to this system. People might know that work from you guys. But beyond sort of GPT-3, what else have you guys been working on, and what's sort of the latest and greatest there at OpenAI?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, GPT-3 is this large transformer neural network that's trained to predict the next word in a large corpus of text. And when we first developed this, it really amazed us with its linguistic competence. But as I said, we're trying to teach machines to perceive and learn about the world in a similar way that humans do. And we perceive the world in text, video, images, we hear, we see. And we're trying to introduce these modalities into AI systems as well. And after GPT-3, in early 2021, we introduced the DALL-E 1 system. And the DALL-E 1 system is a model that's trained to predict the next image instead of the next word in text. And it's very, very similar to GPT-3, but instead of text, we've got text and images pairs of data. So we just changed the data set, and we saw a completely different capability. This model that is now able to generate images with just one prompt. So anyone can give it a prompt and it will generate the image based on that. And after the first DALL-E system, we played around not just with text and images, but also with code. And this is how we developed the CogX model, which is essentially GPT-3, but instead of just text, we also have code. So this system has an understanding of natural language, but also can issue, once you can issue commands in English, you can basically write any sort of code. So it kind of brings programming to the fingertips of anyone. You just provide the command in natural language, and the CogX model is able to write it in programming languages. And one of the most exciting applications of CogX has been the GitHub Copilot, which has been built in collaboration with GitHub. And this is a tool that programmers use, including at OpenAI. And it's a productivity tool. It's really the first time that we're seeing these AI systems join the workforce. Basically, Copilot will look at the code and the comments in your file and suggest the next line or the next few lines. And then the programmer can decide whether to accept or reject the suggestion. And in turn, this makes the model more sophisticated. So the model is learning from this feedback. And then just a couple of months ago, we released DALL-E 2. To show you an illustration of what we've been doing recently, I will show you a quick slide first on GPT-3, which we talked about earlier. And this is just an example of the base GPT-3 model that is following a command versus a much improved GPT-3 model, which we call the aligned GPT-3 model, InstructGPT, which we'll talk a bit about later, that is much better and at following instructions, and it does so safely. But I'll move on to DALL-E. This is our most recent DALL-E model. And this is a improved model compared to our first one. We call it DALL-E 2. It creates more accurate and realistic images with 4 times better resolution. And it can combine these concepts and attributes and styles. And it has learned how this relationship between images and text that's used to describe them. So here you can see the prompt was a painting of a fox in the style of Starry Night, and you can see this beautiful image, the brush strokes and the colors that really resemble Van Gogh's Starry Night. And then another example here, the prompt here was a raccoon astronaut with the cosmos reflecting on the glass of his helmet, dreaming of the stars, digital art. And you can see this really creative and unique image generated by DALL-E. So people have been playing with DALL-E 2. This is another one, a mid-century chair in the shape of an apple. So you can kind of see that it respects the form, the shape of a chair and the functionality of a chair while trying to apply the characteristics of an apple. And that's just really cool. And with DALL-E 2, we improved the data set, we curated the data set more, but also the process is slightly different. We use a diffusion process, which starts with a pattern of random dots and then gradually alters that pattern toward an image when it recognizes specific aspects of that image. And we've just started giving access to DALL-E 2. It's in research phase, and we want to learn more about the capabilities, what the model is capable of, but also about its limitations. And we're giving access to a small group of trusted users so we can understand more about limitations, build mitigations in place, and make these systems more robust and more reliable.
Got it. Well, thanks for sharing some of those examples. And some of you may be familiar with some of these DALL-E 2 examples that members of your sort of trial set have produced, and they're sort of all over Twitter at the moment sometimes. But I'm curious, in terms of real-world use cases of this stuff, I mean, DALL-E 2 seems really cool. You can imagine maybe it would be used to create, for creative agencies or advertising agencies to create images. But, what are some of the real-world use cases of this stuff? And with GPT-3, I think people think, oh, that's great, it can compose text. For a certain length of time, but as you know, there's also been examples of problems with it. After a longer period of time, it often kind of runs off the rails. It sometimes produces information that's not factually accurate, which maybe, depending on the context in which you want to use that information, could be a problem. So, what are you seeing as real-world use cases of this? And I know you have some commercial clients. What are they using the systems for?
So with DALL-E 2, it's still in research phase. We have not made it available commercially yet, and we're just seeing a lot of creative uses by artists and researchers. But with GPT-3 and CogX, we're seeing applications where these are really moving the needle for businesses. So for CogX, as I mentioned earlier, GitHub Copilot is this AI pair programmer tool that provides suggestions for the programmer. And then other applications of codecs that we've seen in production are Figma, which turns Figma designs into high quality code. We've also seen from Replit, which is programming platform that lets users collaborate live. They use codecs to basically understand what the code is doing. And then with GPT-3, we've seen applications such as from Sana Labs, which is generating Q&A and content to build a personalized learning experience for organizations and employees, or KyberTax that makes tax returns far easier for contractors by using GPT-3, and several other companies that are using GPT-3 for education. So as a virtual tour assistant for grade level students, also advertising copy, and many other uses.
Great. I guess, as you know, there have been several criticisms of these large models, large language models in particular, but also these large multimodal models on several grounds. One, there's issues about they're trained on so much data. Potentially, it's very hard to see, what problems they may have ingested. And GPT-3 famously could be prompted to spit out kind of toxic language. That was a problem. And there have been criticisms also about maybe the limitations on what imagery has been fed to the original Dolly. There's also issues around the power consumption that these large models consume in training and the environmental impact of that. And then I think there's just some general issues around accessibility. I mean, you guys have the money to have trained these systems, but I think there's a question about, well, how many other companies could potentially do this, and are you creating this situation where everybody is going to have to become your customer to access these systems? I mean, that would be great for you guys as a company, but maybe not great for the whole world. So how do you respond to those sorts of criticisms of these large systems you're building?
These systems certainly have there is room for optimism in terms of how useful can be to us and helping us solve problems that maybe so far we haven't been able to solve on our own. But obviously there are drawbacks and there are limitations that we need to work through. So one of the main ones is, as you mentioned, are issues around misuse and bias and reliability of these models in practical use cases. And there is this whole field of research, and at OpenAI we dedicate a lot of our time to this, which is around aligning these models to human intent and human preferences. What I mean by that is that we want these models to follow our explicit instruction, but we also want them to follow implicit instruction, similarly how another human would. So we don't want them to stereotype. We don't want them to do harmful things. We want them to be equal. And generally, we just want them to do what we mean. And that's quite fuzzy, and it is hard to define in a very crisp and distilled way. And in order to get there, one of the methods that we use is human feedback. So we bring humans in the loop to provide feedback to the model to make the intent crisper and distill what we mean. And we've done this with GPT-3. So when we first developed GPT-3, we just trained it to predict the next word. We didn't train it to predict the next word safely. And so we used alignment techniques such as reinforcement learning from human feedback to align GPT-3 to human intentions better. And what we discovered was that not only this is safer and more reliable, but it's actually more useful for businesses, and businesses prefer this to the raw GPT-3 model. And this is the first time that safety research has a practical application, and in fact, it's merging with utility, bringing utility to a business. And of course, there are many other issues beyond alignment, but this is just one of the areas where we've seen that we can make models able to align. Because you can imagine that if a model understands language and in that understands the world in images, you could send an instruction to a DALL model saying, I don't want you to output images of real people. And that would be enough for the model to follow that level of instruction. So we think that these techniques of alignment can scale and can get better for sure, and can address issues of reliability with language models, but also with other models. Another area of challenge, big area of challenge for deploying these large models into the world are obviously issues around bias. So these models are as good as the data behind them. They don't have a specific personality or opinion. It's just based on the data that we train them on. And with DALL-E in particular, we have done quite a bit of work to look at the bias in the data set and try to mitigate that early on in the training phase. We didn't wait until the model was ready for deployment to take action. We try to integrate this very early on in the pre-training stage of the model. And but it's really quite a difficult challenge, not only from a sociological aspect and when you're thinking about data distribution and such, but also just from pure technical perspective, it's really quite a challenge. Because, for example, with DALL-E 2, we wanted to make sure that the model would abide by our terms of use and usage guidelines. And looking at our policies around sexual content or violent images, we thought about it, we looked at the training data set, and then we said, okay, we will cut out these images that don't seem in line with our rules and policies, and perhaps this will make the problem less biased in these areas. And after we did that, we audited the model to see what had happened, and we actually found out that certain biases had been amplified because of the data that had been removed. And so then we had to use other techniques in order to restore the balance. So it's this constant, even once you take action, you need to audit what has happened to the system, and figure out how to get a good balance. It's just a really hard problem, and it really takes everyone working on it to figure out how to handle these issues around bias.
Right. What were some? I just want to ask you, what were some of the things that got amplified when you tried, obviously, to take out one kind of imagery? What were the problematic areas that ended up being amplified?
Sure. So, for example, if you tried putting in a prompt, show me an image of a CEO, in the original model would output mostly images of white men, but maybe some other images. And once we removed a bunch of images that had to do with violent content and sexual content, we saw that the model would output only images of white men if the prompt was show me an image of a CEO. And so that's quite an issue, as you can see. And because the data distribution, there is less representation once we cut out certain images. So this can happen. And it's this constant tweaking and auditing of what's going on to figure out, to make sure that you're not making things worse when you're intervening in the data set.
Right. And I imagine when you talk about trying to get human feedback, that you have to be careful about who those humans are, and that you have a diverse set of humans giving feedback, because otherwise there's again a chance that you have these people who are providing the feedback who are themselves too small a group or too homogenous a group, and then you're aligning for a certain set of preferences, but maybe not a set of preferences that would look at the entire distribution of humanity that you want to serve.
Yes, absolutely. This is a very important issue, not only with contracting people to provide human feedback, but also with deploying the product, making sure that you deploy it to as a diverse group of people as possible. Because at the end of the day, we're building these systems, powerful systems that will be deployed in the world, all over the world, which is diverse. And if they haven't been trained, and if we haven't had any experience with a diverse group of people, then they're actually not going to operate well. And they might even reinforce biases in certain groups, or fail to work at all for certain groups. So that's quite important. And this is actually one of the things that we call out in the industry norms that we recently proposed along with Cohere and AI21 Labs. These are a set of industry norms that we are proposing for deployment of large language models. And we're looking at three different areas. One is around misuse, the other is mitigating unintentional harms, and the third one is the people behind the development of the technology, the feedback, the product access, and we provide some guidance as to how we deal with these issues. It's not enforceable, we know that, but it's really a first step to open up the dialogue and discussion around how to move deployment forward and make the systems more reliable. It is a first step, and I also see it as kind of a living document where, as we learn more, we will update this continuously.
Got it. Interesting. Well, I'm going to go to questions from the audience soon, so please think of your questions. But in the meantime, before we get to questions from the audience, I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about a couple things that have been in the news lately that pertain to large models. One particularly pertains to Dolly 2, which is, as you may have seen, I'm sure you did see, that some researchers put out a report saying, oh, it seems to have learned these weird connections between these nonsensical words and certain images, and this got picked up kind of in the media as, oh, Dolly 2's invented a secret language. So I just wanted you to clear that up for everyone. Is it true that Dolly 2 has invented a secret language? If not, what's actually happened here? If you could please clear that up, I think that would be helpful for people.
DALL-E 2 has not invented a secret language. There is no secret language that we know of, no evidence to think that that's the case. But what the model does is that it does understand concepts and connections between words and images, and recreate original images and concepts, but it has nothing to do with a secret language.
Right. And I guess one of the explanations I've seen, but not actually from OpenAI itself, but others saying that it's trying to interpolate between language that it has associated in training from captioning of things it's sort of seen, and that it may be taking parts of scientific taxonomy and trying to sort of morph that towards something else, the same way it's sort of taking an image and morphing it towards something else. Is that, as far as you guys have been able to determine, what's actually causing these artifacts to occur?
It is possible, but in images, obviously, you've got a lot of, there is a lot of text in images and captions, and so it is possible that the generations from DALL-E would contain text in them, and maybe distorted shapes. It is a creative output, after all.
Got it. And the other thing I wanted to ask you about is, of course, the story that got a lot of attention over the weekend, which was about this Google researcher who claimed that the chatbot he was working with, which is based on a large language model, had become sentient. He said he raised this with Google, and they've suspended him as a result of it, although they say it's because he's leaked confidential information. And they say they looked into these claims. It is definitely not sentient. I think most AI researchers have said it's not sentient. But interestingly, OpenAI has sort of artificial general intelligence as its goal. Your chief scientist, Ilya Sutskever, has suggested that he thinks continuing to scale up large language models is an important step towards AGI. And he even tweeted back in February that he thought it was maybe possible that current large language models were quote unquote slightly conscious. I don't know what he meant by that, but you work with him. Maybe you have a view on this. What's OpenAI's view on whether we're close to either consciousness, sentience, or AGI with these large language models?
I will actually separate the question of whether we're close to AGI and whether we're close to or consciousness, because I see them as two different things.
Right.
On consciousness, I think Ilya was mostly referring to the fact that these models are so good sometimes it's indistinguishable from humans, and it's more raising a provoking question. It is a fundamental question, so to debate, and it's not one to be dismissed. But I think rather than a strong belief, it was raising a question. I think that it is hard to determine whether a non-biological system has emotional or spiritual experience that we have, even if the system can claim that. How does it relate to my subjective experience truly? And there is no scientific way, at least so far, to conclusively state objectively that the system is conscious or not. And so I think in this case of mystery, we should perhaps look more to the study of philosophy than science or AI to figure out how to pose the questions and look for answers. But in terms of AGI, I think that we are making a lot of progress towards advanced systems by scaling them up, putting in different data sets, using large supercomputers, having large neural nets. And there is a lot of way for efficiency improvements here. But a good framework to think about how far we are from AGI is to think about the gap between what humans are good at and and where machines are actually not good. And I think that humans are very good at generalizing across different tasks. We can apply ourselves in different contexts, and without much new instruction, we can just apply our existing heuristics. We can reason through the situation and be very comfortable in a new setting, whereas machines have incredible difficulty with this, and we see this in practice. It's a practical problem in the industry where you train a system with a data set and you deploy it in a completely different place. And it might not work, or it will not work as you expected.
Right.
So we're very good at these new settings, and we're good at generalizing in this out of distribution setting, but machines are not good at that. So I think we can use this framework to think how far are we from AGI.
Right, great. Well, let's go to questions from the audience. Who has questions? And please wait for the mic to come to you. And then I may repeat the question just to make sure Mira hears it correctly.
Okay, so I'll start?
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you for the talk. My question is about, we just heard from the DeepMind, and one of the questions that was brought up there is how do they select the problems that they're researching? And I was wondering about OpenAI. How do you decide what kinds of problems are relevant for this? How do you decide what to research? And is it AGI? Is it some other technology?
Okay, I don't know if you heard that, Mira, but the question is basically how do you decide at OpenAI what you're going to work on? And what criteria to use, because there's so many different ways you could go. How do you set priorities?
Certainly. So, with language in particular, we knew that there is a lot of data in natural language. There is a lot of data available, and it is a hard task. It is considered by some as the pinnacle of intelligence, understanding language, but truly understanding language as in the concepts and having a shared understanding of context and being able to reason. There's just so much that comes with language. This is debatable, but some people believe that if you can really master language in its truest form, then you have an intelligent system. And our approach, we started with language because of data, because of these questions, and it is a very hard challenge. But also, when we look at alignment and making the systems more reliable and safer, providing instruction in natural language is quite easy to do so with the interface of a computer. And then we truly, our goal here is to figure out how to build this generally intelligent system. And our hypothesis is that if we can get them to see the world and understand the world in a way that's similar to humans, then perhaps we can get there. And so then we started introducing new modalities, such as images, like you saw with DALL, but also with code. And coding is an interesting case because a lot of people at OpenAI program, and it is something that we can get quick feedback in whether the tool is useful or not. So these are some of the ways in which we prioritize, but the guiding principle is one where we want to introduce data that helps this model see the world in a similar way to the way that humans do.
Great. Other questions? The young woman down here in front.
Hi, I'm curious to know whether the work you're doing at OpenAI can be reverse engineered to essentially help explain AI models in human language, particularly for medical devices gaining approval.
Okay, so the question is, can you reverse engineer what you're doing with these large language models potentially to help with something like a medical device to get approval?
I'm not sure if you can reverse engineer, but I think what is possible is, or probable, is that you can have a conversation, you can have a debate with an AI system that is much more advanced than what we're seeing today, but not that much more, that is actually explaining what is going on. So once it has been fine-tuned on certain data that you are interested in, you can have a conversation with the model almost as if you would with an intern or an analyst, and is actually giving you information or explaining things that you would normally have another smart human explain. So this is kind of how I try to think about it. Is this task something that can be done by a human? If so, I think we could even use today's technology with GPT-3 perhaps, once if we have sufficient data to do something like that.
So it could explain its rationale in natural language? Is that the idea you're saying, that a system could potentially offer an explanation in natural language, as opposed to right now most of these are statistical techniques for trying to explain a large neural network? It could actually explain in normal words what was going on inside its own system.
Yeah, so you can think of that as a new human-machine interface where we can just talk to the computer and these advanced systems in the same way that we are talking right now.
Got it. Other questions? So that hand went up first there, the gentleman on the aisle with the sunglasses.
Thank you. A question about OpenAI and its potential use in defense or attack, however you want to put it, basically military applications, and is that somehow a potential future for what we're creating?
Are there military applications for what OpenAI is doing, and will OpenAI itself work on any military applications?
This technology is definitely dual use. So you could use it for a lot of positive impact, but there are also a lot of risks that come with it. So far, we have not applied it to military applications. We go use case by use case. And the reason for that is that we just don't feel comfortable that we can mitigate all the risks or downsides of such an application. We are still very early on in deployment, and we are learning a lot about how to make the systems more reliable and more robust. An application in military or in medical setting, or maybe also in legal setting, where there is no human in the loop, human in control, is high stakes, and you need to be very confident around the reliability and safety of the model. We're not there yet. We're getting there through this iterative deployment and opening up use cases one by one, but we're not quite there yet.
Great. We probably have time for about 2 more questions. Next question, this gentleman on the end here.
Hi, Ed. So 2 questions. So
can we keep it to 1 question so I can make sure I get 2 people in there?
Okay, so when you get artificial general intelligence, you could take any business, I'm assuming, and just replace it with AGI, and it would run much more efficiently, much more productively. So what will AGI do to capitalism and society?
What will AGI do to capitalism and society? And do you guys worry about that at OpenAI?
We're not sure whether AGI systems are going to completely replace everything that we are doing, or whether they will augment what we are doing, and humans will be working on new things or creative things. I think what most people believe is that it will certainly generate a lot of economic value in the world. It's unclear what will happen exactly with jobs, or what governance systems will look like, or economic and political systems. I think these are really important questions that we need really, like all of society, to consider and think about profoundly, not just people that are working on the scientific side of these systems. And what I can say is that whether an AGI system is something that helps us, augments our capabilities, or replaces us in many other senses in the economic world, it is certainly bound to have a big impact in our lives, in the world. And I think it can have a very positive impact, because there are huge challenges in the world today that we cannot solve on our own, and I don't see how we can solve them without technology, such as climate change and disease. And I think it can help us. It can be a positive future if we actually apply care and foresight in the development and the deployment of these systems.
Great. Another question. This gentleman here.
We've spent and see an awful lot of conversation around big data sets. Are you looking at learning with small micro data sets, and how are you getting along with that?
Okay. Is OpenAI doing any work on learning from small data sets? Because these large models are trained on enormous amounts of data, but are you doing anything with looking at micro data sets?
Yes, certainly. In fact, this is what we do with our Instruct GPT models. These models, because they're already quite smart and they have a good understanding of language, they don't need a lot of guidance to do something different, relatively speaking to the original large data set. So with tens of thousands of examples of good behavior and undesirable behavior, you can guide a GPT level system to follow human intent. So smaller data sets can be really quite useful and handy, especially when you're dealing with a system that's already quite small.
Right. So a large data set to do the pre-training, and then it can be fine-tuned on a small data set. Right. We actually have time for probably one more question. That hand shot up right there. If someone can get a mic to the gentleman behind you there.
Hi. I just wanted to know, do you think that regulations are inhibiting the innovations towards general intelligence and what it is capable of?
Do you think that regulation is inhibiting the pathway towards artificial general intelligence or not?
I think currently the AI developers are sort of self-regulating. I personally don't think that we're at the stage where regulation is inhibiting innovation. I think there is a lot of self-regulation and kind of a need to figure out how to coordinate among actors. But certainly, we speak with different governments and regulators to talk about what they're thinking about, to inform them on what the systems look like, and we welcome regulation, in fact, in these areas. And the most recent guidelines that we launched around large language models are really like a step forward to guide and propose a safe deployment that's different from regulation, but it's really like a first step to open up the public debate.
Great. Well, we're just out of time, and I'm very aware that I'm standing between all of you and the bar, and we're probably standing between Mira and her second cup of coffee in the morning out there in San Francisco. So I want to thank Mira very much for joining us. This has been a fascinating conversation, and thank you all for joining us. And with that, we'll close out today and have a good drink at the bar and have a good cup of coffee.
Thank you so much.